Welcome. You're listening to the Renegade River Show, and my name is Mike Hewitt. Before we get the show going, let me offer a quote, but I have to confess, I've got a couple quotes because I couldn't decide which one I wanted to go with, and inevitably reading them, I thought, you know what, these go together. So let me begin. The strength of the Constitution lies entirely in the determination of each citizen to defend it. Only if every single citizen feels duty-bound to do his share in this defense are the constitutional rights secure. And that wasn't a founding father per se, that was Albert Einstein, and he's known to be a pretty smart fella. But just so that we've got proper definition, I thought I'd offer the second quote. The Constitution is not an instrument for the government to restrain the people. It is an instrument for the people to restrain the government. Patrick Henry, and I think he knew something about it. Today, I've got a very special guest on the line with us. Pete Canucci, welcome to the Renegade River Show.
Thanks, Mike. Glad to be here. Thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, Pete, I'm very excited to have you on today because you speak to a lot of the stuff that, frankly, this show is about, and frankly, it identifies my specific ideology. So I'm really embracing it quite a bit as I've read through some of your writing and some of your work. But before we get off, I've got a couple questions I want to ask you. I've went to the constitutionalenforcement.com website. That's yours, I think, right?
Yes, it is.
That's a PAC?
It is a PAC, yes. We just set it up.
Now, tell me what does the PAC do, Pete? What's it about?
Well, first of all, I've come to the conclusion that the federal government is incapable of restraining itself with the people that are currently at the federal level. But I do feel very strongly that if the states simply enforced the Constitution at the state level, then we could rein the federal government back to its constitutional duties by making any dictate outside of its authority irrelevant. So that's the first overriding principle. The PAC actually goes through and supports candidates at the state and local level that understand the power of the Constitution and their obligation to enforce it at the state level. And as you mentioned earlier in your quotes, the Constitution is really a restraint against the federal government. It's not a restraint against the people. And if the people at the state level, the representatives, actually enforce it, then that means any time that the federal government oversteps its authority, these state representatives will basically say, no, we're not going to implement it. So that's who we support. We support candidates at the state level that actually understand their obligation to enforce the Constitution.
There's a picture floating around, not to take you off the path, but it's a Facebook picture. In fact, recently I put it on my page, but it's been shared by a lot of people. And it says, I don't understand how the Constitution is a living document that protects phone calls, emails, and text messages, yet the Second Amendment only means muskets. And the reason I'm interjecting that logic right now is to kind of point out, is I think that if you were to do a poll of the electorate, the voting public, I think that there's pretty wide-ranging views on what the Constitution is.
I agree. But I think a lot of that is just because of ignorance. I don't think the Constitution is being taught in school. And actually, in my opinion, it's a very straightforward document. It was written, in my opinion, to be understood by the people, not by, an elite aristocracy, basically. And that's why it's in effect, I think it's perfect.
I can't disagree with you on that, but we've even got sitting Supreme Court justices that would, as you're aware, recommend other constitutions over ours because of the constraints it places on the government.
That's right, constraints on the government. And what you were saying earlier in those quotes, I have a very good founding father. I think Thomas Jefferson is one of the best, to be honest with you. But when he was vice president, he actually wrote something called the Kentucky Resolutions of 1798. And right here, he actually explained what should happen, in his opinion, when the federal government oversteps its authority. And he pointed out some things that are very obvious. He says the federal government is not a party to the Constitution, but simply a creation of it. And he says basically that the federal government is not capable of judging whether its own actions are appropriate or not, because that would make its discretion and not the Constitution the rule of the land. He said the only entities that can judge the propriety of federal actions are the parties itself, which are the individual states which ratified the Constitution. And I think that's 100% correct.
So your PAC, back to back to promoting candidates that understand these basic fundamental truths. Are you supporting state candidates, or I don't know how your PAC is set up?
It's state. We have a state and a federal PAC, but the biggest aspect is the state candidates.
Okay, so mostly you're looking for state House and state Senate
Correct.
Candidates that understand what the 10th Amendment means.
10th Amendment plus the Supremacy Clause plus Article 1, Section 8 plus the duties of the President, every aspect of it. One big aspect of it is, federal spending, because right now, according to the Constitution, you cannot spend any money from the federal treasury on anything that's not enumerated in the Constitution. And the big problem is the Constitution is totally trashed, and the federal reps don't even give it lip service, as you alluded to before. But we have to make sure that we do.
Well, we've really gotten to the point culturally where if you quote a founding father, you're kind of chastised and seen as either just a screwball or as a right-wing nut just to quote a founding father. And to me, that's a cultural problem that frankly, I love your plan, but I see the cultural problem as an impediment to promoting and pushing forward with your plan.
Yeah, that's true, but I think that's kind of blown out of proportion, because I actually ran for U.S. Senate against Debbie Stabenow in 2012, and I obviously didn't win, but one thing we had to do was collect 15,000 signatures throughout the state, and I collected about 10,000 myself with my wife, and we went around to gun shows. I walked the streets in many cities throughout Michigan. And when I talked to people, I didn't know if they were Republicans or Democrats or independents or whatever. But the great majority, and I'd say at least 75 to 80%, just wanted government to leave them alone. And these were all people who had small businesses or families that I talked to after business hours. And very, very few wanted additional government support. And I grant you, I didn't walk through the downtown areas such as downtown Detroit, but I did walk through, Bay City, Saginaw, Midland, Cadillac, Traverse City, just cities throughout the state. So I think the great majority of people, even though they don't understand what the actual provisions of the Constitution are, they realize that we are a free nation, or we should be a free nation, and they just want government to get out of their lives.
Tell me something party-wise. Are you a Republican, an independent? Where are you at in terms of party alignment, if at all?
I call myself a constitutionalist because I'm frustrated with both parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, but I am running as a Republican because the Republicans are the party of smaller government, less taxes.
Okay. When you say you are running, are you telling me that you are going to be in this coming U.S. senatorial race as Carl Levin retires?
No, I'm not going to run for the Senate. When I said I was running, that was basically when I was running before. So
I see. Okay, but you're not going to be a candidate, Pete?
Right now, the Senate is a very, very hard nut to crack, and unless I get a lot of support and a lot of money, there's no way I could possibly do it. So,
right.
There are some people, hopefully, that will, pick up the gauntlet and go forward.
I have to tell you this, not to rev your engine up in that direction, but one of the few measurements, and of course this is an extremely small sample, so I want to take it for what it is, but just when I'm posting on Facebook about the various shows that the Renegade River show is going to, or the various guests we're going to be hosting, I can tell you that the mention of your name a couple days ago when I said, notice we're going to have you on the show, received the most likes, it received the most shares. And I tell you that to let you know that I think that you as a person and you as a candidate probably have more support than you know.
I know when I went around the state, we went to just about every single Tea Party and GOP group and any other organization that would host us, and no one could ever criticize the message because the message is straight Constitution, it's straight liberty, and that's what makes our country great.
Yeah, so. You know what I find fascinating about the ideological identifications that we've assigned ourselves to in America, and I say that broad spectrum, is that the long-standing debate has been is the United States center right, or is it center left, or is it center, or where's it at? And frankly, I don't think it's any of that. I think it's I use this term, I'm hoping people will look it up if you're not familiar with it, but I think America's foundation is still classical liberalism. It's still Jeffersonianism. So, and I say that to your point when you talked about all of the people who agreed with the concept of having government just stand down a little bit. I think that's true in a whole bunch of parties, literally the Libertarian Party, the Republican Party, even the Democrat Party. But then the devil's in the details. Yes, they want smaller and less intrusive government, but yes, they still want that check. And they still want to be protected and have entitlements and all of the things that they think that they're getting since they traded their liberty for security.
And that's true, but I think a lot of people want that check because they have no other option. Just imagine if we had no regulation like with the federal regulation like EPA or Obamacare or the OSHA or things like that. And just imagine if our tax rate was not, one of the highest in the world, the corporate tax rate at the federal level, but was in effect non-existent. Every single industry that left the United States for foreign shores, computer manufacturers, call centers, service industries, basically all our manufacturing, would come back because the United States would once again be one of the best business climates in the world. And when these industries came back, then there'd no longer be a need for government dependency payments because these corporations would be looking for employees first to hire the unemployed, obviously. And then they'd be able to get, wean people away from governmental positions into the private sector.
I agree with that. I think that populist politics, it doesn't matter whether it's left, right, center, or whatever you want to flavor it as, but populist politics has done a really fascinatingly powerful job at convincing people about what they're promising with using, via class envy and class warfare. And so it seems like, to your early point about maybe education or ignorance, a lot of folks think that if you tax a corporation, it's some third-party monolith that doesn't affect society and it's free money.
Exactly.
And of course, you're aware, and I hope a lot of the listeners are aware, that you can't tax a corporation. Consumers pay that tax. So we're just levying, we're trying to argue which pocket we want individual citizen tax to come out of, whether we want to have a $19 toaster that's really a $3 toaster, and the difference is all the layers of tax. But people don't seem to slow down long enough. They just accept the class envy argument and move on.
Exactly. And then the other problem is corporations are not charities. They need to produce a profit, and we're in a global market now. So if you have an organization, just as an example, Dell, and they need to produce computers, if they're producing them in the United States with high tax, high labor, high regulation, they can't compete in the global market. So if they're going to succeed as a company, they have to go to the best business climate in the world, which might be Mexico or Korea or China or someplace else to manufacture.
On your plan, let me kind of take us through a little list, if I might. One of the things that caught my eye, well, actually several things, but this particular, the state will no longer accept federal funding for non-constitutional programs. I love the idea, Pete. My concern is the devil's always in the detail. Who defines it as being a constitutional program, and who decides that it isn't?
I think that we have to have an audit of the federal government by independent accounting firms or a conglomeration of independent accounting firms that have to hold the federal government to the same standard as private industries such as Walmart, Apple, and General Motors. And when they do this audit, first it's going to be commissioned by the states, so there won't be any federal input to it. I mean, federal, trying to sway the results of the audit. But I'd like to go through and have the audit broken out into constitutional duties, like how much is spent on defense, how much is spent on immigration, courts, weights and measures, patent office, so forth and so on, all of the enumerated duties. And then have another section, how much is spent on non-enumerated duties, such as health and human services, education, energy, so forth and so on. Based on the historical average, at least 80 to 90% of all federal spending is outside of its constitutional authority. So that's how we'd find out what's the enumerated powers or not.
Well, let me give you an idea of what of the things that occur to me without even putting a whole bunch of thought to it. But We recently gave the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, $1.5 billion or some significant.
I didn't, and I had no desire to do that. That was given over and above the will of the people.
Well, but first off, I agree. The problem with it is, or not, the question becomes, has anybody that did? First off, I'm not even aware of anybody in the House or the Senate on a U.S. level voting to do that. It just is done. And I guess are you aware of what constitutional power they're drawing on to allow that to take place?
In my opinion, they don't even give the Constitution lip service anymore, and the President obviously has no authority to do it on his own. He does have the authority to negotiate treaties with foreign nations, but you have to have the advice and consent of the Senate to do so. And to give away that much money to a foreign nation without congressional support is totally outside the bounds of authority.
So basically what I'm kind of getting at is it your contention that the bureaucracy now is what's running the government and not our elected officials?
I don't even think it's a bureaucracy. I think what it is it's a ideology, which is a, for lack of a better word, a socialist ideology that says government is the solution, and that in order, government needs to perpetuate itself. It's kind of like, just growing and growing the blob, more or less. It's rolling over everything. And we have to change the ideology to get back to a liberty-oriented ideology.
But that goes back to education, and to me it goes first to education, and then an equal portion or ration goes to trying to draw back families again who seem to be a little bit lost.
It is, but those problems are directly related to federal intervention where it has no authority whatsoever. And what I want to do really is the whole key to what I'm proposing is that we have to restructure how the federal government is funded. And even though we passed the 16th Amendment, the 16th Amendment never gave the federal government the ability to directly tax the people. They said they could go through and collect, money, tax any source of income whatsoever, but it didn't give them the authority to directly tax the people, and it didn't give them the authority to implement a progressive tax, as an example. Everything in the Constitution is equal.
So do I understand your plan? I'm reading a quote here from you, I think. All federal taxation collected from individuals or other entities within the state will be deposited into the state treasury rather than being forwarded directly to the federal government.
Exactly.
Yep. So your thought is that in terms of funding the federal government, the state of Michigan should collect those resources, and then the state as an organizational body then passes on whatever the appropriate amount is to the federal government.
Exactly. And that's how it was initially set up within the original Constitution. The census served two purposes. One was representation within the House, but the other purpose was to figure out the proportion of the federal budget which should be taxed directly to the states, which couldn't be met by impost duties or excises.
Okay. Where does entitlements and all of that play a part in what your plan is?
Okay, well, first of all, what would happen is all the federal revenue, rather than being forwarded to Washington, would just be forwarded to the state treasury. About 20% of that would go to the federal government to pay for our constitutionally enumerated programs, which would be defense, immigration, and whatever is enumerated in the Constitution. The great majority, which is currently being used now to pay for entitlements or pay for Medicaid or things like that, we would just retain the difference and use the difference in those federal collections to pay for services the state thinks is important. That's what we would do. I was at CPAC just a little while ago, and Michelle Bachmann gave a speech, and she noted that 70%, and she used this percentage, she said 70% of all money that's collected from the people for entitlements is spent on bureaucracies within Washington, and only 30% of that money actually reaches the recipient.
Yeah.
So if we were able to keep that money right within the state, then we could just use all that money to pay for state services. And what I would venture is we could probably do away with the sales tax, and we could probably do away with the individual income tax in Michigan and the corporate tax in Michigan, and just rely on the excess federal collections to fund all of the state services.
So you're viewing the funding of the federal government strictly and only to have the federal government oversee foreign affairs, the military, and interstate commerce, period. Is that correct?
Whatever the enumerated duties are, so obviously foreign relations and things like that, embassies and whatever. but only what's in the Constitution. And it's not me, that's what the Constitution says, because it says very clearly in the Ninth Amendment, it says the rights of the people are many, not just what's specifically enumerated in the Bill of Rights. But then it says clearly in the 10th Amendment that anything which is not specifically enumerated, any power that's not specifically enumerated for the federal government, falls to the responsibility of the states or the people themselves. The duties of the federal government and the state government are exclusive. They do not overlap. And every single problem that we have in society today is because the federal government has collected so much money from the states, it brings it to Washington, then it sends it back to the states with conditions attached to it. And if we don't follow those conditions, then we don't receive the funding.
True that. Pete, we're going to have to go to a break, but when we come back, I'm going to ask you some questions about state nullification, if I might.
Yeah, I'd look forward to it.
Very nice. We'll be back shortly, everybody.
You're listening to News Talk 1090, WKBZ. News Talk 1090 is the talk of Muskegon.
Renegade River in Spring Lake wants to buy your used handguns and hunting guns. Renegade River, your hunting, camping, and survival store. Stop in and check out their new and used firearms, sporting goods, Army and Navy supplies, and survival gear. Downtown Spring Lake, next to the police station. Be a survivor, not a statistic. Renegade River in Spring Lake has new and used handguns, hunting guns, sporting goods, and survival gear. Protect your rights and your freedom. Ask about their CPL classes. Renegade River, next to the police station in downtown Spring Lake.
The Talkin' Muskegon program can now be heard live every morning, Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. here on News Talk 1090. This is John Van White.
And Brian Worsham. We will focus on community events, news, weather, and sports. We'll also bring you traffic updates, weekly segments like the movies with Ron Van Timmeren, the Biker Report, and Lumberjacks. This is Talkin' Muskegon right here, 8 to 9 a.m. on the Talk of Muskegon, News Talk 1090.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2. Let me tell you how it will be. There's one for you, 19 for me.
Welcome back. You're listening to Mike Hewitt on the Renegade River Show, and I love that song. It tells so much. We're on today with Pete Konecny. Pete, you still with us?
Yes, I am.
I need to dive right into the state nullification thing, so I'm a little excited about that. Tell me about it.
Well, what I think is that the federal government totally ignores the Constitution at the federal level. It's involved itself in every aspect of life, like education, health care, entitlements, banking, student loans, everything, without any authority whatsoever, but it does it because it has some money. What I want to do is we have to reverse that, and the big question is how can we reverse that? And a lot of people say, we should have like a secession from the Union as one thing, which I think would be a terrible mistake, or a revolution or something like that, which, would be the last resort. It would be a terrible mistake because it would destroy the Union. The only solution I can come up with, which makes perfect sense, is to actually enforce the Constitution at the state level. And what that says is that if any federal dictate comes out of Washington, which is outside of their authority, we just ignore it. Do you mind if I give you a real simple example?
No, please.
Okay, well, assume like the state of Michigan, they wanted to save energy, so the State House of Michigan passes a bill, and it says all federal offices have to keep their heating thermostats set to 55 degrees Fahrenheit in the winter, and that all federal employees had to wear sweaters manufactured from green hemp, as an example, to stay warm. And any federal employee that doesn't follow this procedure is going to be punished, imprisoned, or whatever. The federal government, obviously, if they receive that, they would just ignore it. There would not be a court hearing. There wouldn't be anything because the state of Michigan clearly has no authority to impose that type of restriction upon the federal government. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
So if you turn it around and you use the exact same scenario but just change it and you say the federal government, in order to save energy, has decided that incandescent light bulbs are going to be prohibited, And in their place, we have to use government-approved energy-efficient light bulbs that are often filled with carcinogens. And if anyone manufactures incandescent light bulbs or sells incandescent light bulbs, then they're going to be punished, fined, or otherwise, imprisoned or whatever. Well, the states don't just ignore that, because there's clearly, if you look in the Constitution, there's clearly no authority whatsoever for the federal government to outlaw a legal product to save energy. They have no authority or to save the environment. They obviously could restrict interstate commerce if they wanted to, but it would be ridiculous. But even within the state, they have no authority whatsoever. So rather than, compromising with the federal government or negotiating or accepting their dictate, the state should just say, no, we're not going to enforce it. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. And that's just a simple example of what nullification would be. The big problem that we have is funding, because right now, if the state says no to the federal government, then the federal government says, okay, fine, you don't have to implement this provision, this dictate, but we're going to punish you by withholding road funding or withholding school funding or withholding, entitlement funding or Medicaid funding or something like that. And that's why it's so critical that we have to go through and restructure how the federal government is funded.
Absolutely. We saw that example a number of times back when the miles per hour on highways was reduced to 55. They tied funding to that as a way to say to the states that were saying phooey. They did exactly your example.
Exactly. One other thing is, a lot of people say the Supreme Court can rule whether things are constitutional or not. And I disagree with that, because it goes against the Constitution. And let me give you a simple example on that. Assume Mr. Obama appoints 2 more judges to the Supreme Court, and these judges happen to be Sharia compliant. They appreciate Sharia law. And say a case comes before the Supreme Court, and these justices convince 3 other justices, either through argument, which would be fine, or through bribe or through threat, to support the concept that Sharia law is a supreme law of the land, just as an example. So if the Supreme Court says it, does that mean that every single state should go through and start to implement Sharia law throughout the United States? And the answer is obviously not, because Sharia law contradicts the Constitution. And it doesn't matter if 5 individuals at the Supreme Court say that it is constitutional, because it's clearly not. And that's where the states have to go through and take a stand and say, no, it's not constitutional, and we're not going to enforce it. And people say it's a real far-fetched scenario, but if you switch the word Sharia law with the term universal health care, it's the exact same scenario. There's no constitutional justification for universal health care. It negates many, many provisions, such as the 9th Amendment and 10th Amendment, just to be the most obvious ones. But it should not be implemented. And the people at the state of Michigan, and I applaud the Senate, but the people at the state of Michigan should not be negotiating with the federal government or coming up with compacts or anything like that. They should simply say, no, we are not going to enforce this, because it's not a function of the federal government. And the other thing is the supremacy clause in the Constitution. A lot of people say the supremacy clause forces the states to accept laws that are passed by the federal government. But in reality, it's just the opposite. In my opinion, the supremacy clause is a very strong protection against government abuse, because it says clearly the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, that it says any laws passed pursuant to the Constitution are supreme law. And then it has an additional caveat. It says laws cannot negate existing constitutional provisions, and they cannot negate state law. And that's because the duties of the state and the federal government are exclusive. So if the state wanted to, they could go through and just say something to the effect, health care is not a federal issue, and they can quote the relevant parts in the Constitution, and say in the state of Michigan, the health care needs of the population will be handled by the people themselves through the free market, or something to that effect. And that would be a state law that the federal government cannot overstep.
You see, what I'm thinking about, Pete, while you're talking, is that when first off, just a mild disclosure, I often refer to our judiciary, starting with the Supreme Court all the way down, as the single most broken branch of our government.
I agree.
So that is the caveat to what I'm going to say. When I look at, and I'm making notes while I'm talking, a couple of weeks ago we mentioned Samuel Chase on this show, and certainly in a different light, but he was a justice that Jefferson sought to have impeached for essentially creating the judiciary that we wrestle with now. But to your point, to me, when I look at especially the Supreme Court, it doesn't necessarily decide constitutionality. Of course, that's the language that we tie to it. But what it really does is it offers an umbrella to ideology. And my example would be Roe versus Wade. And it doesn't matter what a person's feelings are or particular ideology is on abortion. But the fact that it doesn't exist in the Constitution is not protected. They absolutely invented a way to rationalize this. But the public, it always, to me, is going to go back to the electorate. The public just nodded up and down and said, okay, that's constitutional, and moved on. And to me, that's what's allowed us to get into that jam, and that's going to, without fixing the electorate, I'm not convinced you'll end up with a state house or a state legislative body that's strong enough, that has the will, then frankly has the ideology to move forward, because I think all of these things are ideological. I mean, just as an example with our Republicans in the state house, in the state Senate, mostly the Senate, they were, and our governor, were ramming through an exchange before the Supreme Court had decided one way or another.
That's right.
And that's ideological. So once again, the Supreme Court gave even our own party cover to proceed with what I affectionately refer to as Marxist care.
But that's where you have to go through, and we have to readdress the funding of the federal government. Because right now the federal government has forced dependency of the states upon federal grants. That's what it is. And unless we break that dependency, we are never going to get back to our limited government. And that's where, if we just can explain to people that if we kept all of the money that the federal government collects from the state in the state of Michigan and then forward whatever is due the federal government based on, the Constitution, and use the rest to pay for our programs, it's much, much better. There's, immense benefit to the state in doing that.
Yeah, you mentioned that I think the number was about 70% for administrative costs.
Well, historically, the federal spending from 1787, when the Constitution was ratified, through 1930, federal spending, except for wars, averaged 2 to 3% of gross domestic product.
Right.
Then from 1930 forward, it just ballooned, and now it's well past 26, 27%, with no stop in sight.
Well,
and this is another important thing. When I look at every single graph about taxation, it seems like it's virtually impossible to get more than 20% of gross domestic product from the population through taxation. Because the more you raise taxes, the less economic activity you have, and you actually lose revenue. So since we can only collect 20% of revenue, 20% of gross domestic product as revenue from taxation, when you have more than 20% of gross domestic product in spending, that's when you incur these huge deficits, which is what we're seeing now.
Tell me something, just your opinion, if nothing else, or the result of you talking about this while going to different meetings. If you were to put these items, an example, audit the federal government, if you offered that as a state amendment or a state, if it were on the November ballot, so the question becomes, do you want to audit the federal government? Where do you think the electorate would be on a question like that?
I think most of the people would. It depends on ideology, again, like you say. I think about 60 to 70% of the people would embrace it, saying that we need to actually audit the federal government. The people that think that the federal government is providing benefit to them would probably be scared that they would lose their benefit, and they would probably say, no, leave things as they are.
Okay. And where do you think the people would be on an issue such as nullification? Same kind of thing, or? Same
kind of thing, but what the nullification is actually two aspects of it. The first thing I'd really like to have done, and this is what I'm pushing, is to pass something called the resolutions. And all the resolutions do is they just make a statement. It's not the force of law, but it's just a statement saying this is how the state of Michigan views its relationship with the federal government. And we can go through and just say basically, these are the duties of Congress, and just enumerate them from the Constitution. These are the duties of the President, which are extremely limited, and just enumerate them from the Constitution. And basically say anything that's outside of those duties are null and void in Michigan because the federal government has no authority to impose them. But it's a resolution. And then go through and state, these are how laws are passed. Laws have to be based on the enumerated powers, which is what it says in the Constitution. And just like we were talking about the Supremacy Clause, if a law from the federal government negates the Constitution or a state law, then it's not law of the land. And just put that in a resolution. Explain how the federal government is only authorized to collect money to pay for its constitutional duties. It's not authorized, and it says that right in the first article of Article 1, Section 8. And then just go through and say any money, we never granted the federal government the authority to collect an excessive amount of money from the states and then redistribute it back for functions outside of its authority. Put that in a resolution. And have all these resolutions, and then at the very end say, to address these, we're going to do just what we talked about. We're not going to accept any more money from the federal government. We're going to collect all federal funds and put them in the state treasury. We'll forward whatever we're responsible for enumerated duties to the federal government, but we'll keep the rest in the state and use it for state services. Once we can pass that resolution in Michigan as well as in other states, then we can actually pass the legislation to implement it.
Pete, have you had conversations with any of our current serving state legislators on these topics?
I've tried to have conversations with state legislatures, and most of them don't even want to give me the time of day. I've talked to some federal people, and they support it totally. The best representative I can think of in Congress is Justin Amash, and he supports it wholeheartedly. I've talked to different judges throughout the state, and they agree with the constitutional principle. They mentioned that it's going to be hard to get it passed because of the mindset of the representatives, but they said as far as the constitutional logic, it's sound.
I agree with it, but I'm trying to dial this down to what would my sister Brenda Brown out in Vegas? She'd say, well, tell us how this affects us. Bring it down to our level. How does it affect us? And so I'm trying to dial it back to say, when I look at, I have to use Ottawa County because that's where I'm from, but they've got, it seems like a never-ending list of the next new building or next addition they're doing with 50-50 match money. But when you stand back and look at the county as a whole, it's the administrative buildings that belong to the county are about 50% empty, and I can't think that that's a coincidence. But hey, Pete? We've got to go to a break, and I've still got a bunch on my plate, so stay with us. We'll be right back.
Okay, sounds good.
Great.
Let me tell you how it will be. There's one for you, 19 for me. 'Cause I'm the tax man.
Fox News Radio, I'm Pat O'Neill. Gun control, a topic on the Sunday talk shows. NRA Chief Wayne LaPierre blasted New York Mayor Michael Bloomberg, who's spearheading a new pro-gun control ad campaign.
They don't want him in their restaurants. They don't want him in their homes. They don't want him telling them what food to eat. They sure don't want him telling them what self-defense firearms to own. And he can't buy America.
Mayor Bloomberg says people do have a right to protect themselves.
But also, it's about the public's right to keep guns out of the hands of criminals and the mentally ill.
Both on NBC's Meet the Press. Some good news about the economy in a new poll.
In a new Wall Street Journal survey, experts think the economy will grow at an annual rate 0.5 point higher than previously estimated, 2.2%. Analysts say the numbers show consumers and businesses absorbed higher payroll taxes and higher gas prices without much trouble.
Fox Radio's Steve Knight. Fox News Radio. We report, you decide.
Renegade River in Spring Lake wants to buy your used handguns and hunting guns. Renegade River, your hunting, camping, and survival store. Stop in and check out their new and used firearms, sporting goods, Army and Navy supplies, and survival gear. Downtown Spring Lake, next to the police station. Be a survivor, not a statistic. Renegade River in Spring Lake has new and used handguns, hunting guns, sporting goods, and survival gear. Protect your rights and your freedom. Ask about their CPL classes. Renegade River, next to the police station in downtown Spring Lake.
Hi, this is Jim Riley, your host of Eye on Muskegon, every Sunday morning from 8:30 to 10 and on the internet at eyeonmuskegon.com. Politics can be aggravating and to some just plain boring. But our elected politicians are spending your hard-earned tax dollars and sometimes borrowing from your children to pay for it every day, even here in Muskegon. We'll continue our quest to expose the power that local power brokers and politicians have over you and your family this Sunday morning, 8:30 to 10 at Ion Muskegon on News Talk 1090 WKBZ, the Talk of Muskegon.
1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2.
Let me tell you how it will be. There's one for you, 19.
Welcome back. You're listening to the Renegade River Show, and my name is Mike Hewitt, and today we are on with Pete Konieczny. Pete, you still with us?
Yes, I am.
We're talking state nullification and education, and I'm really disappointed to hear the folks on the state within our state legislative body not being interested in talking about constitutional protections for the state citizens.
See, what I really want to do is I'd like to make sure that when these people are running for office in a couple of years, that when they're vetted in any public event, whether it's Tea Party group, a debate, or something like that, that they're questioned about what's going to happen if they're faced with a decision to either uphold the Constitution or to, in effect, impose tyranny. Because if they actually impose any federal directive that's outside federal authority, they are imposing tyranny. And we have to know what their response is going to be. But one thing you were talking about, and I just wanted to bring this up, it's dealing with federal spending and nullification. If you look at the Hillsdale College example, because Hillsdale College didn't accept any federal funding whatsoever, but then they actually got some indirect funding through student loans and things like that. The federal government came after them and they said, since you're collecting indirect funding, you have to follow all of the directives from the Department of Education. And Hillsdale said no, and they fought it, and they actually lost, but they ended up giving up all of their federal funding, whether it's indirectly received or whatever, from federal or state governments. And now they're totally independent. They have one of the best curriculums in the nation, and they're well off. The same thing would happen if we did the same with the federal government. If we said we're not going to take any funding from the federal government for education, then the state would be able to go through and implement any educational policy it deemed proper, giving complete local control if they thought that was proper, having charter schools, having vouchers, whatever they decided was best scenario, totally outside of federal control. When more than one state adopts this type of reasoning, then the states are going to implement different solutions to the problems facing the people. And once again, we're going to have 50 individual proving grounds of states coming up with the solutions to their citizens' needs. And the best solution is going to be emulated by the states because the states want to actually solve the problems of the people rather than the federal government just wants to address them and address them.
To me, though, Pete, it seems like as a society, and this also goes for most of the state legislators that I know, we ask the wrong question. And what I mean to say when I make that statement is a couple examples. First off, if you look at the medical industry, rather than saying what in the world is going on with the idea of we're trying to wrestle with paying for what amounts to $9 Motrin tablets for overnight stays, $6 cotton balls, $10,000-$15,000 for a 24-hour visit to your local hospital. And as a society, rather than saying, hey, wait a minute, we're not paying that. We're not having that conversation. We're having the conversation of how can we absolutely bankrupt our treasury on a state and federal level to pay for $6 cotton balls. And to me, that's absolute insanity. And then I look at the colleges. And frankly, I think that our higher education is really what's promoting this broken thinking, to be honest with you. And when I look at the colleges and with their tuition rates that they're demanding and the endless books to me, it's all insanity that as a society we're saying, golly gee, that's expensive, how can we pay for it, rather than saying enough, we are not going to do it anymore. And to me, it goes to the same thing as you're talking about with nullification of the federal government, with some of those things that they're doing outside the confines of those obvious statements the Constitution calls them to honor.
That's right. And when you're talking about the medical costs are directly related to government involvement in the system, because we don't have the people that receive the services not responsible for payment. So if we just implemented free market principles back into the healthcare system, it would solve the entire problem overnight. Not overnight, but it would solve the problem.
To me, it's the equivalent of going to your local Ford or Chevy store and saying, you know, how much is that little compact car? And someone saying it's $7 million, and you saying, okay, I'll take it, because you really don't care the government's going to pay for it.
Exactly.
And that's the system we've come to deal with, and it's the result at least on the health side, it's the result of a third-party payer system.
Exactly.
And the only thing I can think of that's worse than a third-party payer system is a single-party payer system. It destroyed the Soviet Union, and it's going to do the same to us.
Right, and single payer is still third party because it's the government is paying it, and they have no incentive to be efficient.
No, they don't. But you mentioned, let me backtrack a little bit. You were talking about, I think Bachman had talked about 70% of each dollar. The last time I saw a study, it was an 87% administration cost. So for every dollar that went towards entitlements, just as an example, 87 cents of it was glommed by the government and used for expense. And so only the difference of 13 cents went on to actually benefit somebody. Exactly. And I think that really goes to the points that your entire platform calls for. The question, so as you go forward with seeking candidates, you'll be looking to challenge, I hope, those incumbents that are refusing to recognize the Constitution and their obligation as servants to the people? Exactly. I think that's about as honorable of a calling as a guy can have, Pete. Mm-hmm. I think it's hugely important. We're at a point where if we don't start embracing these kind of policies, we will not be able to proceed into the future.
Exactly. And we're not just talking to Michigan. We're talking to other states such as Indiana and Arizona and Wyoming and Oklahoma. Because if we can just introduce the concept to their state legislatures, even the Dakotas, as far as the Balkan reserves, or Bobby Jindal down in Louisiana that's been decimated by the moratorium on offshore drilling. If we can get these states that are saying, federal policies are extremely destructive to our states, and if we can have these resolutions passed and say, based on these resolutions, we're just not going to accept federal funding, and we're going to do exactly what we talked about before, then these states are going to excel. Their economies are going to skyrocket, and as soon as one or two or three states pass it, then I think all the other states are going to pass it almost immediately, because it's in their best interest to do so, and it's exactly how the Constitution was originally laid out. It's nothing new, no amendments, no new policies or whatever. It's just enforcing the greatness of the original Constitution. Absolutely. But if we could just ring the bell loud enough, Pete, so that the citizenry would be looking at people, for instance, here in Michigan, that advance this healthcare exchange, we ought to be all in unison saying, what, you too, Brutus? You're stabbing us in the back when we're the ones that went door to door for you and put literature in people's boxes and carried your message to get you elected, and now you're doing a healthcare exchange? Shame on you. That's right. I think the worst of the worst, the scourge of politics, is a candidate that gets elected on conservative principles and then backstabs their supporters. Well, they get there and they get awful squishy. I think some of them get convinced that they get one or two steps higher so they can see across the trees better than the electorate can. And the reality of it is that they get more clouded and they can see less than they could when they embarked on their mission of principle that seems to turn into mush. I agree. So the key has to be seeking candidates and the electorate at the same time to get them aware of these powers that they have. I think so many people have just kind of shrugged and went, what can we do? Right. But there are things that we can do. And the funny thing is, every single state and local official swears to uphold the Constitution. They do. And then when they get into office and they're faced with a decision, whether it's gun control or whether it's Agenda 21 UN policies or whether it's Obamacare or just any policy, educational directives or whatever, they don't even consider the Constitution for the most part, and they just say, okay, we can get free money or we can get perceived benefit or security or whatever by breaking our oath to support the Constitution, and we can't do that because it's a fallacy. Yeah, a lot of it's self-serving, though, Pete. And an example of that is a lot of folks will point to separation of church and state, and they use Jefferson's words in a single letter as an example.
but then they'll debate over the meaning of the Second Amendment and ignore all of the founders' letters about it. And you go, wait a minute now, how come that's so convenient to you? They ignore the hundreds of founders' speeches that were given from the pulpit of churches. And it's like I say, it's very, very self-serving.
But the thing on the Second Amendment is it has nothing to do with safety. What happens is as soon as you can negate the Second Amendment, it allows the federal government to impose complete control over the population. That's obvious. And that's why we have to fight it so much, because without the Second Amendment, we are going to lose our soul as a nation.
The vast bulk of every founder that there was in America offered some statement to that exact effect. But a lot of times I feel like I'm one of the cattle that's being herded through this ever-narrowing fence towards, who knows what. But clearly, to your point, this has a lot more to do with disarmament than any call to save lives, because the issue of saving lives, the math doesn't work for that.
Well, according to the NRA, and I believe the statistics because it's from the government, but you have 2.5 million instances every year in the United States where handguns are used to deter crime. And if you do the math on that, that means several times every single minute, 24 hours a day, someone in the United States is using a handgun to deter crime. And the great majority of times you don't even fire it. It's just, brandishing the handgun and people see it and they run away. But if you disarm the population, that means it's going to be at least 2.5 million more crimes committed against law-abiding citizens every single day.
Yeah, their argument's kind of fascinating in terms of gun control in general. Based on their argument, there should be shootouts in every gun shop in America every day.
That's right. It doesn't make any sense unless you look at it that the government wants to disarm the population to be able to control and subdue us. And then it makes perfect sense.
But it's the same as to the point of our dialogue today. It's the same as using funding to control us. The federal government uses funding to control the county, to control what should be sovereign citizenry, uses funding to control Egypt with the exact same methodology and ideology in mind. The irony is almost deafening that they're using our own funding, it's our money, to control us.
That's right. And that's why we just have to break the cycle. You were talking about being herded, through a narrow chute. The only solution is to turn around. And if you turn around first, you're going to go through and cause a commotion, but then you're going to have other people start turning around too, and then eventually you're going to reverse the flow. And that's what we have to do. That's all I'm trying to do.
Pete, I like it. Tell me in our final moments here, how does a person get in contact with you or reach out to your PAC? How does someone help you with the cause you're pushing?
First, they can go out to the PAC. It's www.constitutionalenforcement.com. Out there's a contact me, and if they do a contact there, it comes directly to me, so I'll answer all the questions. Most importantly, there's a donate button. So we need money in order to support candidates that want to actually honor the Constitution. So donate if that's possible. The other thing is to volunteer. If they can volunteer, then we'll make sure that whenever there's a program or a project that's going on, as far as contacting reps, sending out mailings, setting up cottage meetings or things like that, that we can utilize people to use those services.
Very, very nice. And can I plug you on Facebook also?
Oh, I'd appreciate that. I would truly appreciate it.
Yep, you're certainly a friend on my page, and I appreciate that. And along with, you've got another page on Facebook also, don't you?
Yeah, I have a couple of pages. In fact, my wife has a very good page too. It's Zhana Kanechi. It's her political page. But I don't know if you know it or not, but she grew up in the Soviet Union. She spent the first 30 years of her life there.
I'm going to have her on the show one of these days, Pete.
But she talks about the tactics Lenin actually used to subdue basically an unaware population.
Yep.
And the exact same tactics are being employed by our own government. And it's very, very scary.
No question. I'm going to want her on the show. Pete, thank you very much for joining us today. And to our listeners, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mike.
See everyone next Sunday.
One, two, three, four. 1, 2.
Let me tell you how it will be. There's 1 for you, 19 for me.
Be a survivor, not a statistic. Renegade River in Spring Lake has new and used handguns, hunting guns, sporting goods, and survival gear. Protect your rights and your freedom. Ask about their CPS